There comes a point in life when silence stops feeling empty and starts feeling earned. For many people over 50, living alone is often misunderstood as loneliness, loss, or quiet resignation. Society tends to assume that if someone reaches this stage of life and chooses solitude, something must be missing. A failed relationship, emotional withdrawal, disappointment strong enough to make connection feel no longer worth the effort. But psychology tells a far more interesting story. Because for many people over 50, living alone is not about what they lost. It is about what they finally learned they no longer need. There is something psychologically significant about choosing solitude later in life. It is not the same as the isolation often associated with youth. Younger solitude is often exploratory, uncertain, still shaping itself. Solitude after 50 is usually informed. It is built on experience, comparison, reflection, and emotional pattern recognition. People who prefer living alone at this age have often already experienced the alternatives. They know what companionship feels like. They know the emotional demands of shared space, compromise, constant negotiation, and adapting daily life around another person's rhythms. When they choose solitude now, it is rarely accidental. It is often deliberate clarity. The first major psychological trait behind this preference is a heightened awareness of emotional energy. By midlife, people begin noticing something they often ignored when younger. Not every interaction is neutral. Some relationships restore energy. Others quietly drain it. Decades of experience sharpen this awareness. People over 50 who prefer living alone are often exceptionally attuned to what different social dynamics cost them psychologically. They have spent enough years navigating obligations, compromise, and emotional labor to recognize when peace is more valuable than company. This is not selfishness. It is psychological efficiency. Their nervous system has learned what supports regulation and what disrupts it. Shared living often requires constant microadjustments, small negotiations of routine, noise, timing, mood, and expectation. For many, these adjustments become increasingly exhausting with age. Living alone removes this background tension. It creates a stable emotional climate where regulation becomes easier. The second trait is identity consolidation. Earlier in life, identity is often shaped through external roles: partner, parent, provider, builder, caretaker. Much of adulthood is spent becoming what circumstances require. But after 50, many people experience a psychological shift. External roles begin loosening. Children grow independent. Careers stabilize or slow. Social expectations soften. For perhaps the first time, there is room to ask, who am I when no one needs something from me? People who choose to live alone often respond to this question with unusual honesty. Solitude allows identity to emerge without constant adjustment to external needs. They no longer have to negotiate their preferences into someone else's comfort. Their environment becomes an authentic reflection of self rather than compromise. This often creates profound psychological relief. The third trait is reduced dependence on external validation. Age often changes the reward system. What once felt important, approval, social image, conventional success, begins losing psychological urgency. People over 50 who prefer solitude have often reached a stage where being understood by everyone no longer matters. They trust their internal standards more than social expectation. This makes solitary living psychologically sustainable. They do not require constant affirmation to feel secure. Their sense of worth is less dependent on visible connection. This independence often looks mysterious to younger people, who are still psychologically wired toward belonging and recognition. But it reflects emotional maturity more than detachment. The fourth trait is stronger boundary clarity. Life teaches people what they can tolerate and what they cannot. By 50, many individuals have accumulated enough relational experience to identify patterns quickly. They recognize subtle disrespect, emotional inconsistency, passive demands disguised as affection, the quiet erosion that happens when boundaries are repeatedly ignored. People who prefer living alone often reach this preference through pattern recognition. They learn that protecting peace is easier than repeatedly repairing disruption. This does not mean they fear intimacy. It means they no longer confuse intimacy with obligation. The fifth trait is comfort with internal companionship. Some people feel uneasy alone because silence amplifies internal discomfort. Their own thoughts feel too loud. Their mind becomes something to escape through noise or company. But psychologically healthy solitude requires the opposite. It requires a mind that can remain in its own presence without distress. People over 50 who prefer living alone often develop this ability over decades. They know how to occupy silence meaningfully. Reflection, reading, creativity, routine observation. These become forms of companionship. Their internal world has enough richness to sustain them. This is one of the clearest markers of psychological self-sufficiency. The sixth trait is selective attachment rather than generalized social need. Younger adulthood often values quantity, large social circles, visible connection, constant interaction. Later life often shifts toward quality. People become less interested in broad social approval and more interested in depth. Those who prefer living alone often maintain fewer, but more meaningful connections. They are not disconnected. They are selective. This distinction matters. They do not reject closeness. They reject unnecessary closeness. There is a difference. The seventh trait is freedom sensitivity. After decades shaped by responsibility, autonomy becomes deeply rewarding. Choosing when to wake, eat, rest, think, speak, invite, or remain silent creates a kind of psychological spaciousness many people discover too late. Living alone magnifies this freedom. No negotiation. No emotional weather to monitor. No invisible social calculations shaping every decision. For many over 50, this feels less like loneliness and more like recovery. The eighth trait is reflective recalibration after relational fatigue. Some individuals arrive at solitary living after years of emotionally expensive relationships. Marriage, caregiving, conflict, disappointment, compromise stretched beyond healthy limits. Solitude becomes recalibration. A nervous system long adapted to external emotional demands finally learns stillness. And often, once people experience this peace, they become reluctant to surrender it casually. This is not bitterness. It is nervous system wisdom. The ninth trait is acceptance of impermanence. By 50, most people have experienced loss, relationships ending, people changing, expectations dissolving. These experiences reshape attachment psychology. There is often less urgency to force permanence. People become more comfortable with transience. Living alone often reflects this acceptance. They no longer need constant external proof that life is secure. They understand uncertainty as part of existence. And this understanding makes solitude less frightening. Society often treats living alone after 50 as something sad that needs explanation. But perhaps the real misunderstanding is assuming peace must always look shared. Sometimes peace looks like a quiet home, a familiar chair, morning light through the window, and no pressure to become anything more than exactly who you already are. Personally, I've always admired people over 50 who choose solitude without apology. There is something deeply grounded about someone who has experienced enough of life to know what truly nourishes them. It reminds us that fulfillment does not always arrive through more people, more noise, or more activity. Sometimes it arrives through subtraction, the quiet removal of everything unnecessary until what remains finally feels like home.